As you all may be aware, the Governor Newsom's 30 by 30 initiative to conserve 30% of the state's land and waters by 2030. The California Resources Agency recently released for public comment the draft Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy. This strategy and the definition of conserved has garnered considerable interest and concern. Our next presenter is here to provide some more insight on how rangelands fit into the conservation goals, or do they? It's my pleasure now to introduce our next panelist. It's Jennifer Norris. Jennifer is the Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat under the California Department of Resources. Prior to joining the Resources Agency, Jennifer was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where she was the field supervisor for the Sacramento Fish and Wildlife Service office. Jennifer has an education pedigree longer than I have time to list. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Norris.
Thank you so much, Michael. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you all. My education pedigree is actually less relevant to this conversation than the education that I've had actually bumping around in trucks throughout New Mexico and California on mostly rangelands. So I love hearing Dr. Hunzinger's talk. I should have come a little earlier, so I could have caught all of it, but I will go back and take a look because it's great to see quantified what I've already seen sort of firsthand, which is that rangelands are a really important part of our ecosystem, and protecting them is essential to people's health and well-being, our planet's health and well-being. And so I'm a believer, and I come to you with that. I'm here to talk to you about 30 by 30, but I want to take a small step back and speak about the executive order that Michael referenced. So in October 2020, Governor Newsom signed a nature-based solutions executive order N8220. And 30 by 30 is the thing that everybody loves to focus on, but it actually is a much broader executive order that takes into account a suite of programs and initiatives and interest around really using nature to help us with combating climate change, as well as protecting our biodiversity. And so that executive order contains directives for, the Department of Food and Agriculture, the Resources Agency, Cal EPA, all of us to work together to really deploy nature in these two initiatives. And it recognizes throughout the executive order what I just said at the top, which is that working landscapes are a key piece of the puzzle and important for us to look for ways to support. So 30 by 30 is a subset of that. And as Michael mentioned, the directive is to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. And I remember when the executive order was being drafted, there was a lot of, there are people who know and people who don't know that the words conservation versus preservation and protection, they lead to lots of different meanings to different people. And conservation was the word that I thought was most encompassing of this broad array of landscapes, those that are both, highly protected and somewhat off limits to those that are working lands that people really are using for food and fiber, for example. So we use the word conservation, but now I'm sort of regretting that because it implies somehow that our 30 by 30 goal is the only thing that is conservation, because we had to define it to find a way to count it. If you have to get to a number, you have to have a way to count. And so we had to put out a definition. And now I'm sort of trying to figure out how to explain that we really see conservation as a much broader array of activities. Of course, it goes well beyond sort of this 30 by 30 goal, which is about protecting a place in sort of in a durable way through time. So I put that out there as a way to say, when you read the document, I hope you will sort of keep in mind that we really see 30 by 30 as a piece of a much broader recognition of the importance of natural and working lands to this array of policy initiatives. as Michael said, the document came out. I didn't do a PowerPoint, and I could, but I thought we were going to look at each other and have a conversation. So, but I'm happy to help walk through the document in other ways if that's helpful to you all. But the document came out in December, on December 15th. We are accepting feedback through February 15th. And we really hope you take a look at how we framed things. In my head, I know what we were trying to say, but you're the audience that we're interested in understanding whether we hit the mark. So the document is arranged sort of in 4 main sections. There's our conservation framework, which just sets out, reiterates what's in the executive order, which are the objectives of 30 by 30, which are to protect our biodiversity, address climate change, and expand equitable access to nature. It talks about core commitments that we make. Again, these come from our executive order, which are about advancing equity, justice, and diversity, improving our relationships with tribal partners, as well as safeguarding our economic prosperity, our green energy future, and our food supply. So all of those together really show you that there's a array of things we're balancing here, and we want to really describe 30 by 30 in a way that says what we mean, which is that it should include a broad array of folks in California. We really want to build a movement behind people that want to protect nature. The document then goes into the definition, which focuses on the need for durable protections of the kinds that Lynn was referencing, with regard to what does it look like to have a conservation easement for things like biodiversity, endangered species. We have a very simple definition, which is followed by many pages that illustrate all the ways that we think that can show up on the landscape. And then finally, we have a suite of recommended actions that we hope will advance our 30 by 30. And in that set, conservation easements is called out as one of the key conservation pathways. And this is where I think some of, Michael and I have talked about the need for more funding toward easements. There's more demand than there is funding for it. This is where, and also policies, this is where we try to lay out what those needs are and what those gaps are that need to be filled. Finally, the document gives a preview of how we think we should implement moving forward. That's definitely the weakest part, and where we're still looking for input. What's the best way to work together moving forward? We're interested in conservation being locally driven as it is now, with the state providing support and technical funding, whatever is appropriate. But we don't want this to be a top-down from Sacramento. We want this to really build on the existing efforts that are effective and already in place. So what's the right way to do that? We would love your thoughts, and maybe we can talk about that here today. Finally, I'll just call your attention to the website that was put in the chat. There is also a pretty groovy geographic information system that is you can just play with it if you don't know anything about GIS, or if you're a GIS nerd, you can get deep into it and download data. It sort of goes from simple to complex, but it's a statewide set of maps that really show us, where we have lands that are already conserved and where we have opportunities to meet our, biodiversity, climate, and access goals. That will be a fully functional decision support system when we release our final document, but we gave you a sneak peek of what that's going to look like for this draft. So with that, I'd really just love to take questions and have a conversation. Hopefully some of you have looked at the document. If you've got questions or concerns, I would love to answer those, or anything else that you guys think makes sense.
Thank you, Jennifer. Questions for Jennifer on 30 by 30? We do have one from Dr. Mark Horney. And I'll read this. I can find it. I think I just lost it again. As the chair of the California Rangeland Advisory Committee, or RMAC, under the Board of Forestry, Mark, I'd like to point out that the state statute requires that the Resources Agency, its departments, and Cal EPA and CDFA all communicate with RMAC in regard to any policies or actions that impact and involve rangelands in the state. We surely could have provided useful input on California's 30 by 30 had that statute been followed. And he hopes that to enjoy the conversations with the agency going forward. And I think that's what you're asking for now, Jennifer, is input on the pathways document. And those comments are due by February 15th, I believe.
Yes, and I will say too, on the outreach side, we did spend the last year, I should have said this at the top, we held 9 regional workshops where we sort of virtually went around the state and looked for feedback for people, what are the conservation issues in your state? What are the concerns that you have? What are the opportunities out there? What's working? What's not? We had 5 topical workshops, which were focused on things like, how do we advance climate change through land use? How do we advance equity? What are the concerns around biodiversity? And most importantly, how will we define conservation? And we also, took any meeting that people asked us to have, but we didn't sort of set up, that was the outreach that we did so that we could try to get the biggest number of people. And I probably took hundreds of meetings of people that reached out to me. I apologize if I didn't reach out to a group I should have, but the door is open. We're very interested in your input. That wasn't intentional. We tried to keep all the doors open for anybody to walk through. So please, let's get together. Especially if there's things in this document that aren't helpful, I would love to meet and talk about those.
Maybe you can, I know the RMAC meets regularly. Maybe we can coordinate a chance for you to come speak to them directly.
That'd be great. I would love it.
Another question, much of the conserved rangeland, some of the most productive, protected land, in the state, lands with habitat conservation plans are missing from the 24% mapped as conserved. How does this land get included? And what happens if remapping and improvement of the GS data results in that 30% goal being achieved?
So thank you for asking that question. There is a problem with the maps. So we have our textual definition and what we think counts. And then the maps themselves that are in the GIS are based on the information that we have in the California Protected Areas database and the California Conservation Easement database. So if lands are not properly reported to that database, and the reason for that can be myriad, then they aren't currently being noticed. We think there's about 200,000 acres of easements that are not properly classified right now. I have reached out to the HCP folks and said, hey, you should take a look and let us know if those are wrong. Similarly, if there are easements within the Rangeland Trust that we should be counting, we definitely want to get those into the mix. So our current estimate is it's not going to take us over 30%, but there's absolutely land out there that's not being accounted for in the total. And we'd love to be able to do so. And we're looking to set up processes moving forward to make that a little more automated.
Kind of along those lines, the next question, as I understand the pathways to 30 by 30 document, ag easements, including conservation easements on rangelands, are not considered in the acreage count of conserved lands as they are counted as GAP status codes. 1 and 2 are consistent with the definition of conservation. Agricultural conservation easements appear to be code 3. Therefore, it appears that ag easements are not included in the acreage count. And I might add in that as well as BLM and Forest Service lands that are multiple use, such as grazing and timber. Can you speak to why this is not included?
Well, the definition that we used is those that are protected for, ecosystem function and the species, biodiversity. I should pull up the definition. I don't have it in front of me. But there are a suite of rangeland easements, for example, as well as some agricultural properties that might fit within that. And in the document, we highlight that there are other effective conservation measures that aren't easily classified. And that's a conversation that we want to have moving forward, is how could those places be included in those other DAP codes? So we're willing to have that dialogue. It's just, we didn't get to that level of detail for this document. So I think that's an open question, is how might other effective conservation actions on different kinds of lands, or that maybe don't fit into the obvious definition, be included into this total? But the other point that I made at the top is that, conservation is broader. This is for a specific set of purposes. And so, I've heard from ranchers too, like not all things to all people, rangelands don't have to be, in every single category. We just want support for the important work that you do across the state. And that's what N8220 does.
Following up on that a little bit, just so I know I can understand better, it doesn't appear that lands that have any multiple use, such as grazing or timber management on the public land side, or agricultural conservation, are being counted at all. Yet, as we all know, active management is what really protects those lands. No management is not protecting those lands. Those aren't being conserved into the greatest degree they can. So, and when we read that pathways document and we see that those lands are not counted in that 30% goal, as you, I'm sure you can imagine, that it raises a lot of eyebrows.
So the question I have for you all is, how durable are those actions that you have? That's one question that I think is out there, is the durability of the management. Some of it might, or whether it can be circumscribed within a space. So I don't disagree. There's a lot of really important conservation action that's taking place, but not all of it is sort of durable in a sense that it can't change with the next resource management plan or the next grazing allotment, grazing lease. Can you tell me, educate me, because I would like to understand that better. I don't understand all the nuances of how that works.
Okay. Another question here. In the report, as I read it, there is sort of a tension between hands-off and active management. At times, it seems to preclude things we need, like restoring a patchy forest, and at times may not. Is our baseline California at contact, or now after thousands of years at anthropogenic management?
I would say that the document isn't, I don't think there is a tension with that. I think there are places where active management is absolutely required and needed, and we recognize that that's an important part of what we want to see on the landscape. So if it doesn't say that, tell us how to fix that. There are places where there is very little management, but I think most places in California need some. And I agree, Lynn, grazing is absolutely part of that. And some timber management is part of that. So I'm in agreement.
Question on the comment due date. Is there any chance that will be extended?
No, we already extended it. We had originally put it out for a close at the end of January, and we pushed it back another 2 weeks. We've had 60 days, and I really want to get this done so we can get to work on doing the conservation together. So February 15th is a pretty hard deadline. Okay. But I'm happy to meet with you. If you don't want to put it in a letter and you just want to give me your comments, we can do that too. Whatever is most helpful. We really want to recognize the importance of grazing in this document.
As you're seeing here, there's a theme in these questions. This one is, I'm a bit confused. Over half of California is public, that is federal, state, regional, county, local ownership, which does not include easements. Haven't we already exceeded our 30 by 30 goals?
Again, these are objectives that are specifically for the purposes of protecting biodiversity. That's sort of the fundamental goal of 30 by 30. And I think multiple use lands, some of biodiversity conservation is a piece of that, but it's not always the primary purpose. And so it really, I think a lot of those public lands don't fit into that definition. But I'd take your feedback on it. If you disagree, please share.
Next question. The SRM CalPAC, Society for Rangeland Management, had a fall meeting that looked at collaboration with indigenous tribes for rangeland conservation. Are tribal lands included in any of these conserved lands with regard to the acreage?
So tribal lands have been a little challenging because there's obviously sovereign issues there, and we don't want to just assume, but there are some easements on tribal lands that are obvious, and those get included. And we're in conversations right now with tribal partners about the best way to represent those in our maps. So I'd say generally speaking, no, they're not currently represented.
There are habitat conservation plans on public lands that are not included, such as water district lands, San Francisco Water, East Bay Mud, CCWD are not included, but have habitat conservation plans. Why exclude these?
So those probably fall into that category where they have not been reported properly to the database, but they should be included. So that's an error that we want to fix.
And to your question, Jennifer, about the durability of rangeland management, how is the durability of coastal fisheries considered under 30 by 30? Are fisheries used for food production not counted under the 30 by 30?
You know what? I want you to invite Mark Gold to talk about the coastal water side. I will bundle that if I try to answer. So I'm going to punt.
Okay. And I have one last one here. As to the durability question again, we need to have adaptive management to change management as climate changes, for example, or invasive species. Monitoring can be established to ensure adaptive management meets the goals established. More of a statement, I believe, than a question. And there's several comments here that I think if folks will submit your comments to the agency by that February 15th date, it's going to be really important that we get those out there, and so that Jennifer and her team can hear from you about your thoughts on this 30 by 30 and how we can achieve those goals, recognizing that working lands that are protected should be counted in those. Any other questions for Jennifer? Another statement, monitoring must be established in order to conduct adaptive management, and this has long been a problem. And I have one last question here. It seems that biodiversity has to be an explicit and primary goal of the management plan in order to be counted in 30 by 30. Is this correct? But if biodiversity is a secondary goal or result of primary conservation goals, it won't be counted?
The way that's framed is a little challenging. Biodiversity is sort of the floor. If it's an outcome or an intention, that's not really the essential part of it. It's really whether the land is managed and those outcomes are a result of that management. So it's a tough question. There's so many different kinds of land classifications across California. It's hard to answer that in the general, but the intention is that biodiversity and ecosystem function is a key piece of the puzzle.
All righty. Well, Jennifer, we really appreciate your time today. I know your schedule is extremely busy, especially with all this going on with the pathways. But having you be here today has been a lot to us and very informative. And I expect you'll hear from a lot of folks and some comments coming in on the pathways document by February 15th. And there's a link, I believe, in the chat to that document for those who have not yet had a chance to see it. Again, thank you, Jennifer. We appreciate it. We invite you to stick around if you can and listen to some more of the summit today.
I would like to. Can I say one more thing? Just
Absolutely.
What's really helpful to me, really helpful, is if you say, edit this section by adding this sentence. Like the more specific you can be, the more helpful it is. Because as I think I told you, the intentions are there. And if we miss the mark, it's helpful to point out how we picked the wrong word and it really didn't work for you. So do what you can to be as concrete as you can. That would be really helpful, or actions that you think we should add. So thank you so much, Michael. I really appreciate you inviting me. And as I said, the door is open. I would love to meet with anybody I can. And I can put my contact information in the chat. I'll do that right now.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.